Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session. This is called Hybrid or Native Apps, Determining the Right Mobile App Approach for Your Brand. I'm excited to be here. I wanted to thank Radar for putting this on. So very excited to talk to you about this today. So who am I? Who is this guy that's talking to you? My name's Mike Maxwell. I'm the Senior Vice President of Technology at Hathway. And a little bit about me, I've been leading engineering teams for over 10 years. I've been the head of technology at Hathway for over 5 years, and I have extensive personal iOS, Android, and web experience. So this hybrid versus native debate is something that I'm very interested in, excited in, and I've been living at Hathway and kind of leading our charge in this realm for a while now. If you're not familiar with Hathway, just to give you a little bit about what we do, we help brands bring innovative digital experiences to the market. We do CRM, growth marketing, and analytics and optimization services, and we also do enterprise solution architecture and systems integration. So some of the brands we've worked with, Wingstop, we do their website, their ordering website and apps, Panda Express, Pete's Coffee, Raising Cane's, just a number in the restaurant industry, and we have a couple other industry verticals that we're into. So that's enough about me. What will we be covering today? So number one, we'll be talking about what a hybrid app is and how it differs from a native app. And this kind of baseline understanding is pretty critical to help make a decision on which strategy is right for your brand or your product. Number two, we'll go over some advantages and trade-offs of using a hybrid app approach. And number three, I'll give you some tips and a toolkit on how to decide between hybrid versus native for your brand's app strategy. So first off, what is a hybrid app? I'm going to try and sum this up as succinctly as possible and then go into a little bit of detail. So essentially what hybrid apps do is they take a website and they wrap it in a native iOS or Android shell. But they provide a way to use parts of the native platform to expand functionality beyond the limitations of what a website would normally be able to do. Now, what do I mean? So while it's in my nature to sit here and go down a very deep rabbit hole about all the technical details about how native and hybrid apps are different, I'm going to try and fight that urge and keep it simple. So these are high-level architecture diagrams of what these different strategies look like. But suffice it to say, a native app written in the language native to iOS and Android means that there are no software layers of abstraction between you and the iOS and Android SDK, which is those platforms, the tools they give you to do all the neat stuff and the bells and whistles with iOS and Android. So there's nothing preventing you from using every facet of what those SDKs make available to you. On the other hand, you've got a web app, which introduces a new layer into the mix, the web browser. And as such, the only native device functionality that you have access to is what web browsers, more specifically what HTML5, makes available to you. And while the vast majority of native mobile device features are made available by a web browser, there are some key gaps, namely push notifications, background location tracking, NFC, beacon type stuff isn't always available at HTML5, and a few others. But with all that said, the beauty of a web app is that you write it once and it'll run pretty much anywhere, assuming you do your CSS coding correctly. So the potential for a higher ROI is very, very good. So now, wouldn't it be great if we could take the benefits of a native app working directly with the native platform, and we could take the benefits of a web app with that kind of write once, run everywhere operation, and find a nice middle ground that gives you, all of that in one nice package? Well, that's the whole kind of idea behind a hybrid app. And as you can see, it gets a little more complicated here with a bunch of sub boxes within a box, but suffice it to say that a hybrid app framework, and there are a couple out there, but they all kind of follow this general mentality, they all execute web code within a highly optimized web view running in a native app shell. And the native app shell is what allows you to download the app from the iOS and Android app stores and have it running on your home screen. And they provide a layer that allows the web code to integrate directly with native iOS and Android code and SDKs. Good example is Radar has a Cordova plugin that we actually have used to great benefit that provides access to a lot of location services functionality that we use for enhanced curbside and other location-based functionality. So that's great. Let's go. Let's do hybrid. There's no question here. It's the best of both worlds. Well, I'm here to tell you it comes at a cost. So this is if we zoom in on that whole point about accessing native functionalities. This is kind of a representation of what's going on under the covers. And in engineering, there's a commonly used acronym, KISS, K-I-S-S, which stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid, depending on the nature of the engineer you're working with. But in general, adding more layers, more code, more abstractions, more platforms leads to more complexity, more effort, more costs, and ultimately a lower ROI. Not to mention, like I said, some disgruntled engineers. And a hybrid app does just that. They add in some layers to facilitate this magic of allowing web code to talk to the native platform in order to give you the bells and whistles of working with that native platform. And plugins, which is what I've zoomed in on here, are what encapsulate native functionality and expose it to that web application. I won't go into the nitty-gritties of all those layers, but hopefully you can see that there are layers on top of layers here, and we're talking about way more than just a native app or a web app. And so as such, you have to work through more issues to get all of this to work harmoniously with each other. Cool. So I didn't go down the rabbit hole. We're still all here. But the bottom line is that hybrid apps are mobile websites running in a native shell that use plugins to access native features typically unavailable to web code. Now, keep this in mind. We'll be revisiting this a number of times, but this is kind of that core understanding of what a hybrid app is that ultimately is going to help you make a decision about which direction is the right direction to go in. Now, you may be thinking, well, Mike, it sounds like you're dissuading me from hybrid apps. It sounds like you don't like them. It sounds like there are a lot of problems with them. That's not the case. I just want to make it clear how hybrid apps do their job and how it adds more complexity to the solution. And to take a step positively in the direction of hybrid apps, I'm going to show you a couple examples of hybrid apps and the UI and the UX associated with them. So here's a look and feel comparison of two popular hybrid apps that I think have a great visual style and functionality that are currently on the App Store. So on the left, we've got Untapped. A lot of beer drinkers might use Untapped on a regular basis. So that is an Ionic app, at least based on what's being reported online and what it feels like. And then on the right, we've got one called Movie Daily, which is built with React Native. Now, as an iOS and Android developer, I can tell you that I can almost always spot a hybrid app from a mile away. There are telltale signs that I just pick up on. Things like UI components that aren't standard to iOS and Android, weird tap and multi-tap behavior that doesn't feel snappy, and page flashes and strange loading artifacts that you experience when you run the app. But in my experience at Hathway, I've come to realize that I don't represent the typical app user. At Hathway, we've run numerous user and usability tests that demonstrate that most of our users don't pick up on these subtle signs that I pick up on, and ultimately just want an app that works and feels pretty good. And this is reinforced by native apps, actually, that have a completely non-standard UX and UI, such as Snapchat. Obviously, the millions of users that use Snapchat don't care that they don't use standard iOS and Android components and make a very complex UX that you have to get through. But ultimately, they've been successful. While that's not a hybrid app, that kind of proves the point that people don't care if you're using a standard iOS toolbar or a tab bar, as long as it feels good and it makes sense and it's easy for them to use. So, with that said, I want to show three apps that Hathaway's developed. Going from left to right, we've got Panda Express. In the middle, we've got Noodles & Company. And on the right, we've got Pete's Coffee. So I'm going to leave these here for a moment and ask you to take a close look at them and see if you can tell which is a hybrid application. You don't need to type it in if you want, but you can. But I'm just going to pause here for a moment. All right. So if you think you can tell that's great. And you're like me to some extent, but I'm willing to bet that knowing that would not dissuade you or change your decision from using that app if you were already going to be ordering food from that brand. Assuming it's still a solid experience. Obviously, if it's a horrible experience, that's going to affect users, whether it's native or hybrid anyway. If you can't tell, it's totally fine as well. That kind of proves my point that ultimately most users aren't going to be able to tell the difference. And at this point, you may be thinking, well, now he seems to be telling me that there's no difference between hybrid and native, so I should just be using hybrid all the time, right? Well, again, as things usually are, it's more complicated than that. And this is really where we're going to dive into the points that are important when making a decision about whether to go hybrid, the trade-offs of going with hybrid. The truth is that a hybrid app strategy forces you to make certain trade-offs. And those trade-offs depend on what kind of app you're looking to make. The only way to decide whether a hybrid strategy is right for your app is to weigh the anticipated needs of your app against the trade-offs that come with a hybrid approach. And to explore these, I'm going to kind of use some base facts about what a hybrid app is. And then each of those points lead to a strong point, a strength point, and a weakness point. And so they are interesting counterpoints to each other. So first off, we're going to start with the base foundational assumption that because an app is built from a single code base, again, revisiting that concept that hybrid apps are a single code base, because of this, initial and ongoing development costs for a hybrid app are generally lower than native development, which positively impacts your ROI. Great, perfect, easy. But in our experience, and from what I've seen across the industry, while development costs are generally lower, the delta is not dramatic due to a number of factors. And I'll actually have charts that will show this in a little bit. So again, ROIs are, you get higher ROI, but it's not that significant. So there's a trade-off there. So second, because the hybrid app is built from a single code base, features and fixes developed once apply to all platforms, which means that there will be higher ongoing development velocity. As an engineering manager, I love development velocity. It's the lifeblood of a development team. But features and fixes will work identically across all platforms unless additional effort is spent to customize them. So again, if you need something that's different between iOS or Android, or iOS and Android and web, you're going to have to write extra code to make that work differently. Whereas if you're writing native, those are inherently different anyway. There's going to be different implementations anyway there. So again, a trade-off. And finally, for this kind of base foundation, because a hybrid app is built from a single code base, apps that provide a near identical experience across platforms will reap the biggest savings by going with a hybrid strategy. But the complexity and cost savings of a hybrid app will quickly disappear if the app experience needs to differ by platform, whether it be by functionality, UX, or UI. And as I'll explain later, a lot of times what we see is that brands start with hybrid to get off the ground quickly and kind of accelerate their ROI. But around year 1 or 2, if you continuously are kind of updating the app and adding more and more features, getting into some of the deeper native features and functionality, that ROI savings for hybrid starts to waffle a little bit. And you start to consider whether you want to switch back over to native. And because I may not touch on this later, I'm here to tell you that that switch from hybrid to native isn't necessarily you losing the battle. After all, you theoretically gained more ROI in that first year or two later on. But obviously, if you have to switch over to native, you're going to take another ROI hit while you're developing it and getting it to market. So these are all considerations to make. But you haven't lost the war if you switch from native to hybrid or back again. That's just a sign of your app evolving beyond the technology choice that you made at the time. So let's switch to another foundational assumption. Because a hybrid app is ultimately a website under the covers, the code to implement complex microinteractions, UI components, and animations, which, speaking from experience, the Hathway designers love to do, that is all shared between platforms. You write it once, and you get all that awesome user experience stuff, on every platform you deploy to. But your app styling and microinteractions are written with web technologies such as HTML, JavaScript, CSS, which can lead to them having a stronger, quote, web feeling. And again, this kind of harkens back to that comment I made that I noticed that kind of stuff. A lot of people might, and actually we've seen this in usability tests, that people sometimes say the app just doesn't feel good, and they don't really know why. But it kind of can boil down to these web feeling type hiccups where, a CSS animation may just not feel as good as it written natively in Swift for iOS or Kotlin for Android. So again, this is an important trade-off. Next, because hybrid apps are ultimately a website under the covers, the majority of development can be performed by a team of web developers rather than by specialized developers for each platform. Great. But most people overlook the fact that creating a hybrid app requires a lot of iOS and Android experience. So as such, you'll either need to train up your web devs significantly and up-level them on iOS and Android specifically, or you'll still end up having a couple native developers on your team. And I think this is the thing that A, is overlooked the most, and as a result, B, has the biggest impact on velocity and actual uncovered ROI. A lot of times hybrid app teams will get 80% of the way there to launching something, and then you hit all the challenges of app signing, both on iOS and Android, submitting to the App Store, getting through the review process, and that takes a lot of knowledge, either trained or already gained, to get through that process. And so this is a big speed bump that a lot of hybrid app teams hit. And to kind of expand on this a little bit, because the hybrid app is ultimately a website under the covers, your development team will be made up almost entirely of web developers that are plentiful in the job market, and developers working on a single shared code base will promote better and easier collaboration between team members. As an engineering manager, I can tell you that, if everyone's working on the same code base, velocity is higher, collaboration is better, things are more efficient. But again, if I go back to the previous point, most aren't aware that you'll still need a couple of people that are very experienced in building and releasing native apps to handle app signing. To handle app signing, custom plugin development, handle DevOps around the app, and know how to get through Apple and Google's review and release process. And this is where the unfortunate fact is that you'll end up probably having a couple or needing a couple of unicorns on your team, people that just are grade A problem solvers that want to dig into this stuff, that want to be experts on all three platforms, rather than just a web developer that wants to stick to doing web code. And previously I said it's very easy to find web developers in the market, but as you probably know, it's a lot harder to find those unicorns that know web, iOS, and Android almost equally or enough to get a hybrid app to market. And as such, you're probably going to end up paying a little more for those key resources that can kind of, get this app to market and push it through, figure out a way to make it happen. So with all that said, we're going to dive a little bit more into the team makeup of what a native app team versus a hybrid app team generally looks like. And for comparison purposes, what I've done is I basically said, okay, we need to achieve 1 unit of velocity on each platform. Doesn't matter what a unit is. You can call it an FTE, developer working on it full time. You can call it story points, whatever you want. But let's just say we're achieving 1 unit of velocity. So on the left, you've got a native app team. On the right, you've got a hybrid app team. And at the top row, we've got the core team, the people that are actually working on the app experience, that are adding features, that are implementing the UI, that are getting the app to market. Those are full-time people generally, and that's kind of where you scale up and you get more velocity. On the bottom, you've got the support team that's needed to kind of support those developers, to glue things together, and like I said, to kind of get the app onto the App Store, submitted, all that stuff. So a native app team, you've got 1 iOS developer and 1 Android developer, and then they're supported by a DevOps engineer. Generally, in my experience, iOS developers and Android developers know how to submit to the App Store. They know how to do signing, so you don't need that added support of that down in the lower row. On the hybrid app team, you've got 1 web developer that is essentially supported by 3 people: a DevOps engineer, an iOS developer, and an Android developer. Like I said, for these aren't necessarily full-time people. They may not even be engaged during the entire, course of development, But at key moments, you're probably going to need them to kind of help the team get through those speed bumps that you see getting an iOS and Android app to market. So right now you can see the native app team is more efficient. The hybrid app team has a couple more people that have to kind of collaborate with each other. So, maybe the velocity on the right is actually lower than on the left. But rarely do we work at 1 unit of velocity. Generally, you need 2 kind of core developers working on something. You get a lot more efficiency that way. They can play ideas off of each other, and that's just something we've observed. So here we're talking about 2 units of velocity, and this is where you really start to see a dramatic difference. So on the native app team side, we've scaled up both iOS and Android to have 2 core developers. And on the hybrid app team, we now have 2 web developers. But the support team stays the same. So as we scale up, the native app team is going to cost twice as much potentially as the hybrid app team. And let's not forget, this assumes you're not even launching a website, right? So on the native app team side, if you were launching a website as well, you'd probably have 2 web developers over there as well. So now you're up to 6 developers. On the hybrid app team, theoretically, your web developers are creating your website and then turning around and creating your hybrid apps as well. So there's anywhere between a 2x and 3x delta between the number of core team developers you need for a native app and a website versus what you need for a hybrid app. So what does this all mean in terms of overall effort and ROI? So this is a chart I made. I took those team models and I kind of built it out based on a 170-hour month, multiplied by the number of people, and then kind of made some experienced choices on how much DevOps and how much of the iOS and Android developer time we need based on the phase of the project. So this assumes a month 3 launch and then ongoing development through a full year. And as you can see, the blue line is the native team model. The cumulative number of hours of spent developing the app starts to pull away from the hybrid team model. And I'm even being fairly conservative in the hybrid team model, kind of overcompensating for some additional iOS and Android time, assuming that you're going to kind of continuously need those people to add more native plugins to do more cool stuff with the app. So as you can see, over time, the costs get higher for the native app. So it seems like a slam dunk, right? Well, now we get into the ROI. And what I've done here is I basically said, okay, if we launch in month 3 and we assume that the app provides about $500,000 of value, whatever value might be, it could be engagement, it could be bringing people in the funnel, it could be conversion if you're an e-commerce site, but let's assume $500,000 of value. How does the ROI shake out if we take the costs of what the hours I said previously? As you can see in month 3, when we launch, the ROI is slightly higher with a hybrid app model. You're only about, 75K off, which, isn't a huge delta. But again, over time, the hybrid app starts to pull away. But even when you get to month 12, you're only about $500,000 away from a native app strategy. Or from an equivalent kind of native app team. And this is where you kind of have to ask the key question of, is $500,000 of value, and again, you need to tweak this based on the value that the app will provide your organization, but would $500,000 of ROI warrant having an app experience that may not feel quite as good as a native app experience? And that's really the ultimate question, at least in my experience, one of the key questions that you have to ask when selecting whether a hybrid app strategy or a native app strategy makes sense for what you're trying to build. So now we kind of get into the nitty-gritties. How do you ultimately pick the right strategy for your app? And I'll be honest with you, this is probably the #1 question I've gotten over the past 2 years from brands, from people in my network, just my wife, just anyone. And I love talking about it. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, and the answer is different for everyone. But I'm going to boil it down to these 3 things, because I think if you can examine what you expect your app to be and make choices about what direction your app is going to head in, that will ultimately inform whether hybrid makes sense or native makes sense. So what I've done here in the middle, we've got kind of the question areas, or the areas that you kind of need to explore. And then if the answer to those questions is the text on the right, then that is a point or points in favor of a hybrid strategy working for you. And conversely, if the left is more in line with what you're trying to do, then native is going to be a better fit. So experience differentiation, meaning how much does the experience need to differ between web and iOS and Android, or between iOS and Android? And if your app experience is expected to be identical across all platforms, then that lends itself to a hybrid app approach. You're going to see more gains, you're going to experience those lower development costs, and you'll be able to have higher velocity because you won't have to rely on those iOS and Android developers as much, or you won't be bifurcating the code in key points to kind of, ultimately, if your iOS and Android hybrid app experiences are different, you're still going to be writing two sets of code. They're just going to happen to be in a web language rather than in Swift and Kotlin. But if your experience needs to be unique across all platforms, that lends itself to native, and you start to trend towards the left side. So now in the middle, native mobile functionality. How much native functionality, like I mentioned, push notifications, background capabilities, location tracking in the background for things like geofencing, like radar does for enhanced curbside. If you're going to have a minimal amount of native only functionality, or you only need to add it once, and that's going to keep your app running for years to come, then hybrid probably makes a lot of sense. Again, I'm not saying that any native mobile functionality throws hybrid out the window. Ultimately, it comes down to, is there a plugin out there for the framework you're using that already has the native functionality you're looking for? And there are a lot out there: Firebase, Radar, push notifications. A lot of the frameworks make their own native plugins to kind of promote that you use that framework more often. But again, it comes at a cost. You kind of need that iOS and Android experience. And especially if you need to create your own custom native plugin, that's where you start to get into a way more kind of complicated scenario. So finally, and this, I think, like I said, is one of the biggest things you have to make a decision on for your app. Which is a higher priority? Is it accelerated time to market and accelerated and rapid ROI? Hybrid is probably a very good choice. Is it a best-in-class native experience that, ultimately you want to do it as inexpensively as possible, but ultimately the experience is more important than the cost and the ROI? Native's probably going to be better in that case. And we have a lot of people, I've talked to a lot of people that they don't like making the choice saying, I'm going to go with hybrid, but I'm not willing to sacrifice the experience. I want the experience to be identical as it would be to native. At that point, you've kind of lost the battle. If you're doing so much optimization to make it look and feel like a native app in the hybrid app, that ROI delta between native and hybrid is going to shrink and shrink and shrink. And ultimately, your web devs are just going to be writing web code that tries to make it look and feel like a native app, rather than just leaning into web technologies, getting 80% of the way there with kind of a very animation heavy, I'd say Snapchat-like experience that, just has animations all over the place and just feels very much like a native app. If you try and reproduce that in a hybrid app, it's just not going to work. I'm not saying it can't work, but the ROI trade-off is going to be significant. I don't think it's going to work out for you. So, with all that said, the bottom line is there is no one-size-fits-all answer to whether hybrid or native is a better strategy. It's something that every brand, every product owner, every CTO, every SVP has to kind of look at with their team and think about how they're going to staff their team, what existing resources they have that could build this, whether they want to be in the business of dealing with keeping a build system running around a hybrid app versus it being more out of the box with a native app. These are all just considerations and questions that have to be asked that'll ultimately lead to the answer. And I'm a metaphor guy. I will admit this one's not the best, but this is what's going on in my mind. It's comparing the two is kind of like comparing apples to oranges when you're already shopping for fruit. ultimately, they're both going to get you to market, and they are both going to provide an ROI. And it's not the kind of thing where if you make a decision on one, it might be the worst decision ever. Like I said, you're still going to get the app to market. You're probably still going to be successful, but you're just going to be fighting your dev team's going to be fighting different battles, and you're going to have to solve a different kind of challenge along the way. So I will leave it with that, and I will take it over to questions. Lindsay has got some queued up for me, so give me a moment to finagle this over. All right, so first question from sounds like Sophia. One major setback that I have experienced in Xamarin apps is integration push notifications into hybrid app. The devs were not qualified for that integration. Yes, 100%. So not only are push notifications, on Android, they're fairly straightforward. On iOS, it's kind of a nightmare. And I've written the backend service that actually sends out push notifications. And just the way Apple does it between sandbox and production and what works in debug and what works in release, it's very complicated. Again, that's one of those areas that unless someone's been around the block with push notifications on iOS, which if they're a web developer, they probably haven't been, that's going to be a challenge. That is a classic example of a challenge that you're going to have to face and is going to take time from your dev team to solve. So question for Michael, do you see Flutter addressing some of the other performance issues that exist in other cross-platform development frameworks? Great question. It's a good chance to explain not all hybrid frameworks are built the same. So Ionic is very much, you write a website and you run it in a shell. React Native and Flutter, React Native is written in React, which is JavaScript-like, but it's a little different. I think it's JSX. It's kind of an XML type code. Flutter uses Dart, which is, I don't know how common that language is, but it would be it's not necessarily a language that's like easy to find. It's much easier to find a Node.js developer or a JavaScript developer than a Dart developer. So, but what those platforms do is they actually do compile that language into native iOS and Android components. So some of the UI components in apps like that will look and feel more native. Maybe they won't be the exact like iOS native component, but in the example of Flutter, it'll actually compile down into Google Material Design components that are natively built rather than necessarily being web-based. So the performance of those apps end up being slightly better because they are kind of what I say closer to the bare metal of the device. They're closer to being a native app than being a web app, but you still experience a lot of the challenges of you've got layers that are in your way to get to the native functionality. And my understanding, I've worked with Flutter a little bit, but you still have to find a plugin or write a custom plugin. A good example would be, okay, I want to integrate with Radar, and I'm going to, for argument's sake, say that Radar does not have a Flutter plugin, but they might. If you want to use Radar, you then have to create your own Flutter plugin, which again, you're down in, you've got people writing in Dart for the Flutter app, and now you need iOS and Android developers under the covers supporting that effort. So same kind of problems that you would deal with. Question from Alex: how do you weigh the long-term? Sorry, I was making sure I wasn't over on time. How do you weigh the long-term risks of using third-party toolset like Ionic? Vendor lock-in, slower new feature adoption, developer experience, etc. This is a fantastic question. I will say that something like picking a hybrid framework is a lot like adding a dependency to your code. You need to make dang sure that that dependency is popular, well-maintained, secure, and is kind of keeping up with trends in whatever they're related to. And Ionic is the same way. You kind of have to take a look at people's experiences with Ionic and figure out, are they keeping up to date with, say, iOS 14 that just came out, a couple months ago? I will say they're abstracted a little because ultimately, like, they're running in a web view. So like a web view generally doesn't break between iOS, updates or Android updates, but those native plugins sometimes will, break from version to version. And then again, that's where you need an iOS or Android developer, because it usually doesn't break at the JavaScript layer, usually breaks down in the iOS or Android layer. So now you got to get an iOS or Android dev to go in and figure out what's breaking, what changed between the various versions of iOS, and tackle that. Vendor lock-in, that you're going to get that no matter what you go with. I would almost say even with native, you're going to go with that. Even right now, there's this epic battle going on between people in iOS using Swift UI versus the typical UI kit thing, and everyone thinks they're right. Whatever code you pick, you're kind of stuck with it, and you run the risk of that being deprecated eventually. So, it's something, that's going to be the case no matter what you go with. Part 2 from Alex. Additionally, can you clarify your distinction between hybrid web-based tools like Ionic? Oh yeah, so I think I touched on this one. And Xamarin, I think, is also like React Native and Flutter in that it's actually compiling down into iOS and Android code. There is some web stuff going on, but those, again, I would say there's one less layer for frameworks like React Native, Flutter, and Xamarin, in that you're writing in a language that isn't necessarily web. Although I think Xamarin, I can't remember Xamarin's C# or web. It could be either. And then that's compiling down to go native. But you've got a bunch of layers in between that make it difficult to implement a pure iOS experience or a pure Android experience. But again, that may not matter. And ultimately, it's what developers do you have on your team? Is this app going to require you to go hire new developers, or do you want to try and leverage the existing ones you have on your team? That's also a big question. At Hathway, we have iOS developers, Android developers, web developers, and Ionic developers. And obviously we're flexing them between accounts. We have the ability to do that at the scale we're at. But if you're just a product company and you're starting out and you only have 2 developers, if those developers are rock stars in JavaScript and are very interested in learning the ins and outs of iOS and Android, then maybe you go with Ionic because you can leverage what you've already got. But if you can hire iOS and Android devs, that might be a better way to go. So the hiring implications of the choice you make is also a factor to be considered. So I will leave it at that. I believe I'm over time, so I thank people for sticking with me. I hope you learned something from this. If anyone has any other follow-up questions, you can stop by the Hathway booth this afternoon. Lindsay, I believe, from Hathway will be there, and we'll be happy to talk with you and take questions and help you learn more about Hathway. We're going to take a break now, so feel free to check out the side sessions and networking, and we will see you back here on the stage in 30 minutes, although it might be a little less since I went over. So check the schedule and come back then. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and be healthy, be happy. Bye-bye.